I want to begin this story with a moment I did not recognize as important when it happened. It was a quiet evening, the kind that slips by unnoticed, the kind of night you never expect to become the beginning of everything falling apart. I was sitting on the couch, half listening to the soft hum of the television, and my wife was across the room, holding a warm mug of tea she never touched. The light from the lamp beside her cast a soft glow over her face, and for a second, she looked almost distant, almost lost in a place I could not follow. I remember asking her if she was all right, and I remember her answering yes, but her eyes did not match her voice. They were soft, but heavy, as if she was carrying something she did not know how to put into words. At that time, I told myself that everyone has quiet days. I told myself marriage has moments like this, moments where one person feels far away even while sitting in the same room. I told myself not to overthink it. But now, after everything that happened, I can see that night clearly. I can see how her silence was not just silence. It was distance. It was fear. It was guilt beginning to take shape long before I understood what was happening. Looking back, I realized things do not break loudly. They rarely explode all at once. Most of the time, they crack slowly, in little moments that feel too small to matter. A paused breath, a forced smile, a sentence cut short, a glance that lasts a second too long. All of these things are warnings we never want to see as warnings. That night, she sat with her tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cup, as if holding it kept her from falling apart. She kept her eyes low, and when she finally looked up, she gave me a small smile that felt practiced, like something she had been rehearsing. I remember feeling something shift inside me, something quiet but uneasy. But I pushed it away. I trusted her. I believed in the life we had built. I believed that whatever was troubling her was temporary, something we would talk about eventually, something we could fix. I believed that our home was strong enough to survive anything. I did not know then that the truth was already sitting in the room with us. It was hiding between her words, buried under the way she held her breath each time her phone lit up. It was sitting in the space between us, waiting for the right moment to tear everything open. I wish I could say I saw it coming, but I did not. Or maybe I did, and I simply didn't want to admit it. Because when you love someone, you learn to ignore the things that scare you. You learn to tell yourself stories that make the pain feel smaller. You learn to trust even when something inside you whispers that trust is slipping away. That evening, her tea went cold. She never took a sip. She just held the mug like it was anchoring her to the moment. At one point she looked at me with a softness I still remember, a softness that felt like goodbye even though I didn't know it then. I asked her again if she wanted to talk. She shook her head gently and said she was only tired. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile a person uses when they're trying not to let their heart show. I believed her. I shouldn't have, but I did. And that was the start of everything breaking. Not with a fight, not with accusations, not with a confession, just a quiet night, a cold cup of tea, and a woman who had already begun slipping away from me. I thought the hardest part of this story would be discovering her lies. I thought the betrayal itself would be the thing that shattered me. But I was wrong. The lies were only the doorway. The betrayal was only the beginning. The truth that waited on the other side of it all, that truth hurt more than anything she ever did. And I was not ready for it. This is where my story begins. With a peaceful evening that was anything but peaceful. With a wife whose heart was already drifting. With a man who didn't know that his life was about to unravel in ways he never imagined. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the start of a journey through pain, confusion, anger, regret, and eventually, understanding. A journey I never asked for, but one I needed in ways I could not understand at the time. And if you are listening now, maybe it is because you know what it feels like to sense something slipping away. Maybe you know what it feels like to watch someone you love become a stranger in slow motion. Maybe you, too, have felt the weight of a silence that makes your chest tight. If so, then you will understand why this story still sits heavy in my heart, and why the truth I uncovered later nearly broke me more than the lies ever could. This is the beginning, and the end. The end is darker, deeper, and more painful than I ever expected. But before I get there, I need to tell you how it all started, and why that small, quiet moment with a cold mug of tea will stay with me for the rest of my life. In the weeks that followed that quiet night, something inside our home began to feel different. It was not sudden, and it was not loud. It was a slow shift, the kind of shift you only recognize in hindsight, When you look back and see all the little signs that were right there in front of you. Signs I ignored, signs I explained away, signs I convinced myself meant nothing. My wife began moving through the house differently. She walked with a kind of carefulness, as if every step needed thought. Her voice grew softer, almost cautious. When we sat together, she looked at me and then looked away quickly, like she was afraid I would see something she was trying to hide. Even the way she breathed felt different. There were nights I watched her lie in bed, her back turned to me, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too heavy, too emotional, too filled with thoughts she wasn't sharing. I tried to talk to her. I asked her how her day had been. I asked her if everything at work was all right. She always answered, but her answers were short, flat, and careful. Work was fine, just tired. Nothing new. And every time, she smiled. A polite smile. A gentle smile. But not a real one. You learn the difference when you've lived with someone long enough. You learn what their real smile looks like, the one that reaches their eyes, the one that softens their whole face. Her smiles didn't do that anymore. They were surface smiles, masks, shields. And I started to wonder, quietly, in late-night thoughts I didn't speak out loud, if her love for me was fading. I wondered if something had broken in her heart long before that text message ever appeared. I wondered if the woman I loved was slipping away not because of someone else, but because something inside her was tearing her apart. But even then, I didn't imagine the truth that was coming. Not even close. One evening, about a month after the message from M, I walked into the house and found her sitting on the edge of our bed. She was still wearing her work clothes, her hair tied up loosely, her shoulders hunched forward as if she were carrying the weight of something too heavy to keep standing. The door was halfway open, and I stopped there, just watching her for a moment. She didn't know I was there. And she was crying. Quietly. The kind of crying that comes from deep inside. The kind that doesn't shake the body, but breaks something in the soul. I stepped inside the room and gently called her name. She wiped her face quickly and forced a small smile, but her eyes were still glossy, and her voice cracked when she said she was fine. I walked over and sat beside her. For a moment, she rested her head on my shoulder, something she hadn't done in weeks. I felt her breath tremble, and I wrapped my arm around her. For that brief moment, I thought maybe we were finding our way back to each other. Maybe the distance between us was finally closing. Maybe she wanted to talk, to open up, to share whatever was haunting her. But then her phone vibrated. She sat up quickly, wiped her face again, and stood, stepping away from me. She picked up her phone, glanced at the screen, and locked it immediately. I asked who it was. She said it was no one important. She said it was work. She said she didn't want to talk about it. And just like that, whatever moment we had was gone. It slipped through my fingers like water, and I felt the space between us grow again, deeper and colder. That night, she slept with her back to me. But she didn't sleep much. I could hear her breathing change every time her thoughts overwhelmed her. I could feel her shifting, restless and uncomfortable. And I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much of our marriage was real anymore. A week later, something happened that forced everything into the open. It was a Saturday morning. I was making coffee in the kitchen, and she was in the shower. Her phone was on the counter again. It lit up with a message. And this time, I didn't mean to look at it. My eyes simply caught the words by accident. I'm scared. We can't keep this secret forever. The contact name wasn't M this time. It wasn't saved as anything. It was just a number. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. My hands went cold. The sound of the coffee machine faded into the background until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. When she stepped out of the bathroom, I was holding her phone. Her eyes widened the moment she saw it in my hand. Not with anger, not with annoyance, but with fear. Real, sharp fear. I handed her the phone and asked her to tell me the truth. Not the half-truths. Not the soft reassurances. Not the explanations that made everything sound smaller than it was. I asked her to tell me everything. She sat at the table slowly, placing the phone between us like it was evidence she was afraid to touch. Her hands trembled, and she looked down at her fingers instead of at my face. Her breathing was uneven. And then, when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It's not what you think. But this time, I didn't let that answer stand. I asked her again. I told her I needed the truth, all of it, no matter how painful or complicated or confusing it was. I told her this was our marriage, not a place for secrets or hidden shadows. She closed her eyes, and the longest silence I had ever heard filled the room. Then she exhaled slowly, and her shoulders slumped, as if the weight she'd been carrying had finally become too heavy to hold. She told me she had lied. Not just once, not just about texts, but about something far deeper. She told me she had been hiding something for months, something she didn't know how to say, something that terrified her more than losing me. And I braced myself. I thought she was going to tell me she was in love with someone else. I thought she was going to tell me she had been having an affair. I thought she was going to tell me everything I had feared from the moment I saw that first message from M. But what she told me was nothing like what I expected. It was something far more complicated, something far more painful. She told me she had been hiding a secret that had nothing to do with another man. She told me she had been seeing a therapist in secret, not for stress, not for work, but because she had been struggling with something she thought she could control on her own. She told me she had been diagnosed with depression, severe depression, months before the distance between us began. She told me she didn't tell me because she was ashamed, because she didn't want to be a burden, because she didn't want me to look at her differently. She told me she had been afraid of being weak in my eyes, afraid of not being enough, afraid of breaking the image of strength she thought she was supposed to carry as a wife. And then she told me something that made the room go still, something that took the breath from my lungs. She told me she had been having suicidal thoughts. Not once, not twice, for months. She told me the text messages weren't romantic. They weren't from a lover. They were from a support group contact and from a crisis counselor she had been speaking to secretly. She told me M was a mentor figure in her therapy program, someone who had crossed emotional boundaries, someone who she had tried to push away, someone who had made things more confusing than they should have been. And she broke down, completely. She cried in a way I had never seen her cry before. Her whole body shook. Her hands covered her face. Her breathing was uneven, pained, desperate. I sat there stunned, not angry, not relieved, not anything I could put into words, just stunned, because her betrayal wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't about another man. It wasn't about desire or passion or drifting love. It was about pain, deep, silent pain, pain she had carried alone, pain she didn't trust me enough to share, pain she feared would make her a burden, and that hurt more than any affair ever could, that she didn't trust me with her darkness, that she chose to suffer in silence rather than reach out for my hand, that she believed she had to hide her brokenness from the man she shared her life with. I reached for her hands, but she pulled away at first, as if she didn't believe she deserved comfort. I told her I wish she had told me. I told her I wasn't angry, just hurt that she had carried this alone. I told her I would have stood by her, supported her, walked with her through every shadow and fear. She whispered that she didn't think I would want a wife who was broken. She didn't think I would understand. She didn't think I would stay. And that was the moment something broke inside me. Not because of betrayal, not because of lies, but because the woman I loved had been drowning inches away from me, and I never saw it. I never reached for her. I never noticed how deep her pain really was. I thought she had grown distant because her heart had drifted. But the truth was far harder. Her heart was hurting, badly, silently. The rest of that day was a blur of tears, long pauses, and conversations that felt heavy and fragile. She told me she hadn't wanted the messages to look suspicious, but she panicked whenever I got near her phone. She told me she should have explained, but shame kept holding her back. She told me she wasn't in love with anyone else. She was simply terrified of falling apart completely. That night, I sat beside her in bed while she cried into my shoulder. I held her the way I should have held her weeks earlier, when she first started drifting. I held her like I was afraid she would slip away forever if I let go. For a moment, I thought this was the hardest truth I would ever hear. But I was wrong. There was still more she wasn't telling me. Something deeper. Something she struggled to say even now, with everything already spilling out. Something that would break me in a way no lie, no secret, and no betrayal had ever done. And that part of the truth, that part was still waiting in the dark, waiting for the moment when she could finally say it out loud. That night was the first time in a long time that we fell asleep holding each other. But even as she rested against me, her breathing shaky and uneven, I could feel that there was still something she hadn't said. Something sitting behind her eyes. Something she was afraid to speak. People think that when a truth finally comes out, relief follows. But sometimes the truth is only the doorway to a deeper truth. A darker truth. A truth that waits for its own moment to strike. I kept my arm around her until her breathing finally slowed. She fell asleep with her hand resting lightly against my chest, like she was afraid to let go even in her dreams. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the night, trying to piece together the fragments of everything she'd told me. Depression, therapy, suicidal thoughts, shame, silence. I wondered how long she had been carrying all of it alone. How many nights she had cried in the bathroom with the door locked. How many mornings she had forced a smile so I wouldn't notice her trembling. How many days she had walked through life feeling like she was about to collapse while I assumed she was fine. The guilt settled heavily in my chest. Because I had been there, in the same house, the same bed, and I never saw the darkness she was drowning in. When she woke the next morning, her eyes were tired and swollen. She looked fragile, delicate in a way that made my heart ache. She tried to hide her face at first, like she didn't want me to see the traces of last night's tears. I told her she didn't need to hide anything from me. Not anymore. Not ever again. She nodded softly, but her eyes lowered again, and I could still feel a distance. Not the distance of secrets that had already cracked open, but the distance of someone holding something they weren't ready to reveal. Something that required more courage than she had found last night. As we made breakfast in silence, I watched her carefully. Every movement was slow, thoughtful, as if her body was tired from carrying too much for too long. She held the mug of coffee with both hands, not because it was hot, but because she seemed to need something solid to grip. At one point, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part fear, part sadness, part something else entirely. I asked her what she was thinking. She shook her head gently. "Not yet," she whispered. And that was the moment I knew. There was still more. Something she hadn't gathered the strength to say. Later that evening, she asked if we could sit in the living room. She wanted to talk more. I nodded, turning off the lights until only the soft glow of the lamp beside the couch remained. She sat with her knees pulled close, her fingers restless, touching and untouching each other. She stared at her hands for a long time before she whispered, "I'm scared." I scooted closer. "You're safe. You can tell me anything." She looked up, her eyes filling with tears almost immediately. "I don't want you to hate me." And right then, my chest tightened. Because people only say that before confessing something heavy, something they think will change everything. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I told her she could speak freely. I told her nothing she said would make me stop caring for her. She took a shaky breath and nodded slowly. "There's something I've been trying to tell you for a long time. Something I didn't want to admit to myself." My heart pounded, preparing for anything, an affair, a hidden debt, something from her past. I braced myself for a confession that would alter everything I believed about our marriage. But when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost didn't catch the words. "I'm pregnant." For a second, the world went still. Pregnant. The word echoed through my mind, sharp and clear. Pregnant. But then reality rushed in. The dates, the timeline, the distance, her secrecy, her fear. And I said the only thing that rose automatically from my chest. "How long?" She swallowed hard, tears immediately spilling over. "About 3 months. 3 months. 3 months." My hands went numb. My breath caught. Because 3 months ago, things between us were already strained. We had been distant, barely speaking, barely touching, barely holding each other. I knew the truth before she said anything else, but I needed to hear it. Needed to make sure my mind wasn't filling in the wrong pieces. And I whispered, my voice barely holding itself together, "Is it mine?" She broke. Completely. Her whole body collapsed forward as she cried into her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." The room spun. I didn't yell. I couldn't. There was no air in my lungs to raise my voice. Just a deep, crushing pressure in my chest, like my heart had been squeezed too tightly. She sobbed harder, shaking uncontrollably, reaching for me and pulling her hand back again, like she didn't know if she had the right to touch me. I sat there frozen, staring at the floor, at the couch, at nothing. My mind was racing and completely blank at the same time. Pregnant. 3 months. Not sure if the child was mine. This was the truth she had been hiding. Not the depression. Not the therapy. Not the crisis messages. This was the truth that had terrified her into silence. The truth that had twisted her between guilt and fear. The truth that she knew would break something inside me. And it did. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not even betrayal, but a kind of grief I had never felt before. A grief that came from realizing the life we had built was not what I thought it was. A grief that came from knowing a child might enter the world under the shadow of doubt and pain. She kept whispering through her tears, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." I finally found my voice, but it came out strained. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She wiped her face, shaking her head as if she couldn't catch a breath. "I was scared. I didn't know how you would react. I thought if I waited, if I figured things out, if I understood what I wanted to do." Her voice broke again. "I didn't want you to look at me differently. But how could I not? How could I stare at the woman I loved, the woman I trusted, the woman I chose, and not feel the sting of everything crashing down?" I didn't move away from her, but I didn't move closer either. I just sat there, caught between heartbreak and numbness. She whispered, "I don't want to lose you." But the truth was, I didn't know if she already had. We sat like that for a long time, her crying softly, me staring into a future that suddenly looked nothing like the one I imagined. Eventually, she leaned her head against my arm. I didn't push her away. I didn't hold her either. I just let her rest there, the weight of her confession still settling on my shoulders. I wished I had words, but I had none. Just a long, quiet ache spreading through me. After a while, she whispered again, barely audible, "There's more." My heart sank deeper, because every time she said those words, my world changed a little more. I didn't react. I didn't speak. I just waited. She wiped her face slowly, took a shaky breath, and whispered, "The man, the one who might be the father, it wasn't love. It wasn't an affair in the way you think. It was a mistake. A moment I regret more than anything. A moment I wish I could erase from my life." My voice returned, broken. "Who is he?" Her eyes closed, and when she finally said the name, my entire body went still. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone far away. It wasn't someone she barely knew. It was someone I did know. Someone I had trusted. But that part of the truth, that will come next. There is no easy way to tell it. No gentle way to walk into that pain. But I will. Because this is my story. And I promise to tell it honestly. When she finally spoke the name, the air left my lungs. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and tightened their fist around my heart. I sat there, staring at her, trying to make sense of the word that had just left her mouth. It was a simple name, one I had spoken hundreds of times over the years, sometimes with annoyance, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with trust so deep I never thought I would question it. It was the name of my friend. Not a close friend, but someone I had known long enough to trust. Someone who had been in our home, who had eaten at our table, who had talked to me like a man talks to another man he respects. Someone who had asked about my life, my work, my marriage. Someone I never once suspected of crossing a line with my wife. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat tightened around every word that tried to come out. The silence between us grew heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. She looked at me with eyes filled with guilt and fear, but also with something softer, something that looked like regret carved into her bones. I asked her how it happened. My voice came out quiet, flat, almost emotionless, because if I allowed myself to feel everything at once, I knew I would fall apart right there beside her. She hesitated. I could tell she didn't want to say it. She didn't want to describe the moment she betrayed me, the moment she broke our vows, the moment she crossed a line she didn't think she would ever cross. But I needed to hear it. Not because I wanted to hurt myself further, but because I needed to understand how we got here. I needed to understand what part of our life had failed so deeply that something like this could happen. She said it happened on a night when she felt completely alone. A night when she had been drowning in her own thoughts, her own sadness, her own pain. A night when she felt like I didn't see her anymore, like she was invisible inside her own home. She told me he came over to drop something off, something small, unimportant, something that should have meant nothing. She told me I wasn't home. She told me they talked. She told me he asked her if she was all right, and she said no. She told me he hugged her. She told me she let him. And then she told me everything after that happened fast. Too fast. Fast enough that she didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't stop herself. She told me she had felt empty and broken and desperate for something. Anything that made her feel alive for even a moment. I closed my eyes as she spoke. I imagined the scene, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop myself. The images were blurry and painful and heavy. each one cutting deeper than the last. She said she regretted it the moment it happened. She said she pulled away. She said she cried. She said he apologized. She said they both panicked. And she said she told him never to speak of it again, never to come near her like that again, never to let that moment exist outside of that night. But it did exist. It existed inside her. It existed inside me now. And it existed in the life growing inside her stomach. She said they didn't talk after that. Not about the night. Not about anything personal. She said she tried to forget it happened. She said she tried to bury it. She said she told herself it was a mistake, a one-time moment, a fragment of a night she wished she could erase. And then she found out she was pregnant. And everything she buried came back. Every fear, every guilt, every question she didn't know how to answer. She said she wanted to tell me. She said she tried. She said she opened her mouth many times, but nothing came out. She said she convinced herself the baby might still be mine. She said she convinced herself that telling me would destroy everything, and she didn't want to lose me. But in hiding the truth, she lost me anyway, just in a different way. I asked her why she talked to the crisis counselor instead of me. She said she didn't know how to tell me she had failed as a wife. She didn't know how to tell me she had fallen apart in a moment of weakness. She didn't know how to tell me she didn't even recognize herself anymore. I asked her if she had feelings for him. She shook her head immediately. No, she whispered. Not ever. Not once. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was pain. It was a broken moment. But broken moments still break people. And they were breaking me now. I stood up slowly, because sitting there felt suffocating. She reached out for me, grabbing my hand, but I gently pulled away. Her face crumpled at the gesture, and she whispered my name with a kind of desperation that made my chest tighten. I walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street, the dim glow of the streetlights, the empty sidewalks. Everything outside looked peaceful, calm, undisturbed. And I wondered how the world could stay so steady while mine was falling apart piece by piece. She asked me to say something. Anything. She said the silence was killing her. But I didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough to hold the weight of what she had confessed. I told her I needed a moment. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. I walked out of the room and sat in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to breathe. For a long time, I stared at the floor. The quiet of the house felt loud. My thoughts felt tangled. My heart felt heavy. I thought of the life we had built. I thought of the memories we shared. I thought of the promises we made on our wedding day. I thought of the nights we laughed, the mornings we woke up in each other's arms, the conversations we had about the future we wanted. And then I thought of everything she had carried alone, her pain, her depression, her fear, her mistakes. I thought of how lonely she must have felt. I thought of how blind I had been to her suffering. A part of me hated what she did. Another part of me hurt for her. And another part didn't know what to feel anymore. After a long time, I went back into the room. She sat there with her knees pulled close again, her face buried in her hands. When she heard me come in, she looked up with eyes red and swollen. I sat beside her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to seem cold. Somewhere in the middle, because that's where my heart was at that moment. She whispered, "Are you going to leave me?" I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know the answer yet. I didn't know what the right thing was. I didn't know what my heart could handle. I told her I needed time. Time to breathe. Time to think. Time to understand everything that had happened. She nodded slowly, as if she expected that. But her tears came again, silent and steady. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against mine, barely touching. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered again, softer this time, almost like a prayer. And that's when I finally looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was tired, broken, filled with guilt and fear and pain. This wasn't the face of a woman who didn't love me. This wasn't the face of someone who wanted to hurt me. This was the face of someone who had been lost inside herself long before she ever made a mistake. A part of me wanted to reach for her. Another part of me couldn't move. I was torn in two directions, love and heartbreak pulling at me with equal strength. I told her I wasn't walking away that night, but I didn't promise anything beyond that. I couldn't. She nodded again, accepting the small comfort even if it wasn't enough. We went to bed in silence. She curled up on her side, facing away from me. Not out of anger, not out of distance, but out of shame. I lay there for hours, listening to her breathing, thinking of everything she had said, everything she had held inside, everything that could come next. Was the child mine? Was our marriage strong enough to survive this? Was her heart still tangled in pain too deep for me to reach? Was I strong enough to forgive? Was forgiveness even the right choice? Was this the end or the beginning of something new? Something harder, something uncertain, something fragile? I didn't know. All I knew was that the truth hurt more than the lie ever could have. Not because of what she did, but because of why she did it. Because of the darkness she had been drowning in while I walked through life, believing everything was fine. As I lay there, staring into the darkness, one realization settled heavily inside me. Sometimes betrayal comes from love that has been hurting quietly for too long. Sometimes mistakes happen in the shadows of pain no one talks about. Sometimes the truth doesn't make someone a monster. It reveals they were human all along. And sometimes the hardest truth isn't that someone failed you. It's realizing you failed them in ways you never saw coming. I didn't sleep that night. But she did, finally, after crying herself into exhaustion. And as she slept, I watched her and wondered if two broken people could still find a way back to each other. I didn't know the answer. Not yet. But the next morning would bring it one step closer. I wish I could say that after that night, things started to make sense. But the truth is they became even more confusing. There were days when she felt close again, like the woman I had built a life with was slowly returning. She would ask about my day, or sit beside me on the couch and rest her head on my shoulder, and for a moment I felt hope. I held on to those moments like a man who had been drifting alone in the ocean and suddenly saw a small piece of land in the distance. But just as I reached for that feeling, she would pull away again, as if something inside her resisted closeness. It was like she was fighting a battle I could not see, a battle she did not want me to be part of. I kept wondering if I had done something wrong. I wondered if I had missed something important in our marriage, if I had failed to notice a need she had tried to express. I replayed years in my head, moments when she seemed unhappy or distant, memories I once brushed off as normal married life. I tried to understand the pattern, but all I found were loose threads. Nothing added up. Nothing felt connected. It was like holding puzzle pieces from different sets. Sometimes, when we lay in bed at night, I could feel her breathing differently. It was softer, shallow, almost nervous. There were nights she turned her back to me and stayed very still, as if she didn't want me to touch her, as if the warmth of my hand on her arm would bring up something she didn't want to feel. I pretended I didn't notice. I told myself she was tired, stressed, overwhelmed. The truth was heavier, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. One night, when the room was quiet and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, she whispered my name. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't the way she usually said it. There was hesitation in her voice, like she was testing whether she could still speak to me in the way she once had. I turned to her and asked what was wrong. She said she had trouble sleeping. That was all. Nothing more. She didn't say why. She didn't tell me what was running through her mind. She just lay there, looking at the ceiling, breathing in slow, careful breaths. I reached out to touch her hand, and she let me, but her fingers didn't wrap around mine the way they used to. They were still, delicate, unsure. I held her hand anyway. I held it like I was trying to remind her of who we were. But even then, something in her grip felt temporary, like she wasn't really with me even though our hands were touching. In the morning, she got out of bed earlier than usual. She moved quietly, trying not to wake me, but I wasn't asleep. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she stood at the edge of the bed, looking down at me for a moment. She had a sad expression on her face, one I couldn't understand at the time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was a kind of sorrow that made my chest tighten, a sorrow that made it feel like she was mourning something even though nothing had been said aloud. She left the room without saying a word, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling a heaviness settle over me. It was the kind of heaviness that comes before a storm, before everything breaks open. That day, I tried to keep things normal. I made breakfast. I asked if she wanted some. She said she wasn't hungry. She said it gently, but her voice was distant again. She sat at the table with her legs pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold even though the sunlight was warm. I asked her again if she was all right, and again she said yes, with the same quiet tone that told me she didn't want to talk. I didn't push her. Maybe I should have. Maybe things would have been different if I had asked her to sit with me, if I had insisted we talk about what was creating that distance. But at that time, I kept telling myself that people go through phases. I told myself that all she needed was space. I thought giving her time was an act of love. I didn't realize she was slipping away with every moment I stayed silent. Later that afternoon, I found her in the living room sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back resting against the couch. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the tiredness that comes from carrying too many emotions at once. She looked up when I entered the room, and she forced a small smile. It was always the same kind of smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. I sat on the opposite side of the room, giving her the distance she seemed to want. For a long while, we didn't speak. We just existed in the same space, separated by silence that felt too loud. At some point, she looked down at her hands and whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "I feel lost." Those 3 words sank into me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to help her. She had never said anything like that before. I moved closer, not too close, just enough so she knew I was there. I told her she wasn't alone. I told her we could get through anything together. I told her I would listen if she wanted to talk. She nodded, but she didn't speak again. She leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes, as if she wanted to disappear into the moment. I watched her for a long time. I watched the rise and fall of her chest. I watched the way her fingers curled and uncurled nervously. I watched her trying to hold herself together, and I felt a fear inside me that I didn't want to name. I didn't want to admit that something was slipping beyond my reach. I didn't want to believe that our marriage was entering a place I didn't understand. That night, she went to bed early. I stayed in the living room, sitting in the dark long after the lights had been turned off. I stared at the shadows on the walls, feeling that uneasy pull inside my chest again. It was a quiet ache, a silent alarm that kept growing louder even though nothing obvious was happening. When I finally walked into the bedroom, she was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. Her breathing was steady, but her body was tense. I stood there for a while, looking at her, wondering how someone you love so deeply can suddenly feel like a stranger. I wondered what was happening in her mind. I wondered what she was hiding. I wondered if she still loved me, and the thought alone made my throat tighten. I lay beside her and stared at the ceiling. I counted the slow ticks of the clock. I listened to the faint sound of a car passing outside. I waited for sleep, but it didn't come. All I felt was a quiet fear, one that wrapped around my chest and didn't let go. And deep down, I sensed something I didn't want to admit yet. The real storm hadn't even started. There is a strange kind of loneliness that grows inside a person when the person they love is still right there beside them. It does not come all at once. It builds slowly, like a soft pressure you barely notice until suddenly it becomes hard to breathe. That was where I found myself in the days that followed. I was living next to a woman I still loved, but the connection that used to bind us felt thinner each day, stretched so far I could feel it trembling like a thread about to snap. I started paying attention to details I used to overlook. The way she kept her phone facing down most of the time. The way she would step into another room to answer calls she claimed were nothing important. The way she moved through the house like she was walking through a place that no longer felt like home. I noticed her smiles became shorter, and her eyes often drifted toward the window, as if she was waiting for something, or someone, who was not me. Still, I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions. I reminded myself that people change, that stress can shape a person's behavior in ways we do not understand. I told myself I trusted her, and I did. Or maybe I trusted the version of her I remembered, the woman who once held my hand with certainty, who rested her head on my chest like she belonged there. One evening, she said she needed to go out for some air. She used to ask if I wanted to come with her, but this time she simply grabbed her keys and said she would be back soon. Something inside me tightened, but I didn't say anything. I stood by the window after she left and watched her car pull away. The sky was turning a soft shade of blue, the kind that comes right before dusk softens the world. I waited for her car to disappear from view, and when it did, I felt an uncomfortable hollowness settle in my stomach. She returned more than an hour later. When she walked through the door, there was a faint hint of perfume on her clothes, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't strong, but it lingered long enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't say anything that night. I just watched her move around the room with a quiet energy, as if she was trying not to disturb the air around us. Days went by like this, each one adding to the invisible weight pressing against my chest. The truth is, when you begin to doubt the behavior of someone you love, nothing feels stable. You question yourself constantly, your intuition, your observations, even your memories. You wonder if you're imagining things. You wonder if your fear is louder than reality. You wonder if you are the problem. One night, I reached my breaking point, not because of something she said, but because of something she didn't say. We were sitting at dinner. The table was quiet except for the sound of silverware against plates. She kept staring at her food with a distant look, as if she wasn't really there. I tried to start a conversation about something small, my day, maybe, or something I saw online, but she nodded without looking up. It wasn't unkind, just detached. Then her phone buzzed. She froze. It was a second, maybe less, but I felt it. Her hand paused in midair. Her eyes flicked toward the phone. She swallowed. Her breath caught for a moment. Then she slowly turned the phone over so she couldn't see the screen. I asked her if everything was all right, and she said yes. But it was the softest lie she had ever told. After dinner, she went to shower. While the water ran, her phone lit up on the counter. Just one vibration. One message. And even though I didn't move toward it, even though I didn't read it, the moment felt like a line had been drawn in the sand. I had always believed trust was unshakable, something you either had or didn't. But I learned trust was like glass. Once a crack forms, you feel it every time you look at it. You run your finger along it, hoping it doesn't break further, but you're always aware of that thin fracture running through the middle. That night, I lay awake long after she had fallen asleep. She slept on her side, facing away from me, her shoulders curled inward, as if protecting something fragile inside her. I watched her breathing rise and fall. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to touch her arm, slide closer, ask her what she was hiding. But I also feared the answer. Not because I didn't want the truth, but because I wasn't sure if I could handle it. It's strange how silence can feel louder than shouting. Our bedroom felt filled with it. A heavy kind of quiet. A quiet that pressed against my ribs. The next morning, I tried again. I asked her how she was feeling. I asked if she wanted to talk. But she shook her head and offered me another one of those practice smiles. She said she was fine. She was just stressed. She just needed time. Her voice was soft and steady, but her eyes told a different story. A story she didn't want me to read. Around noon, she said she was going to visit a friend. She grabbed her purse, her phone, and her jacket. Before she left, she paused at the doorway. She looked at me like she wanted to say something more, something meaningful, something real. But the words never came. She gave me a small nod, then stepped outside. I watched her go again, and once more, that familiar ache pressed into my chest. I told myself not to follow her, not to question her, not to fall into the trap of suspicion. But my mind felt heavier than ever. A mix of fear and confusion began to twist inside me. Years of trust were battling against minutes of doubt. Hours passed. She didn't return. Outside, the sky darkened. A light rain began to fall. I kept glancing at the door, expecting her to walk in at any moment, but she didn't. When she finally came home, she looked drained. Her hair was slightly damp from the rain, and her eyes were red, not swollen from crying, just tired, like she had been thinking too much. She walked past me with a soft hey, her voice barely above a whisper. I asked her where she had been. I didn't mean it accusingly. I meant it the way a husband worried about his wife asks, trying to understand. But she froze again. It was the same stillness she had at dinner the night before. The same hesitation I had been seeing more often. She said she had lost track of time. Her voice was even, but the explanation felt thin, like fabric stretched too far. She went straight to the bedroom after that. She didn't try to fill the silence. She didn't offer more information. She didn't act guilty, but she didn't act open either. And I felt it again, the crack widening. Later, when she stepped into the shower again, I stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of the water hitting the tiles. I stared at the closed door. I stared at her phone lying on the nightstand. For the first time in our marriage, I felt the urge to reach for it. I didn't. But the fact that I wanted to, that alone broke something inside me. Trust is a fragile thing. Not just the trust you have in someone else, but the trust you have in yourself. The trust that your instincts are fair. The trust that you are not imagining the shift happening right in front of you. That night, when she came out of the shower, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. A mixture of exhaustion and something else, something that looked almost like fear. She climbed into bed without a word. I joined her. The room felt colder than usual. She turned onto her side again, facing away from me, and I lay there staring into the darkness, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. I felt something change inside me in that moment. Not anger, not bitterness, not suspicion, just a quiet realization. Something was wrong, truly wrong. And whatever it was, she wasn't ready to tell me. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Maybe she was protecting herself. Maybe she was protecting something else entirely. But I knew one thing with painful clarity. Our life, the one I thought was strong, the one I believed was unshakable, was beginning to split at the seams. And the worst part was, I had no idea yet how deep that unraveling would go. The days that followed were some of the heaviest I had ever experienced. Every small sound in the house felt magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even her footsteps, light as they were, seemed to echo in my chest. I began noticing patterns I hadn't before, little habits I once found comforting that now felt like signs pointing towards something I didn't want to admit. She would disappear for long stretches during the day. She said she was running errands, meeting friends, taking walks, but each time she returned, I could sense a weight on her shoulders that hadn't been there before. The laughter she sometimes forced into our home felt hollow, like an echo bouncing in a room without walls. And every time she smiled at me, I caught a glimpse of something she was trying to hide, a quiet, lingering tension in her eyes, a hesitation in her voice, a pause that wasn't there before. I tried to speak with her, gently, patiently. I asked if she wanted to talk, to share anything weighing on her mind. Most of the time, she would shake her head and give me a small, polite smile. Sometimes, she would whisper that she was fine or just tired, but the way she said it made me feel like I wasn't supposed to question her, like the very act of asking might push her further away. One night, I couldn't sleep again. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened, replaying every word she had said. The betrayal I thought I had seen in the messages, the revelations about her depression, the pregnancy uncertainty, it all tumbled through my mind, each layer heavier than the one before. I realized that what hurt the most wasn't a single act or a secret. It was the feeling that I no longer fully knew the woman I loved. That realization tore through me with a quiet ferocity, shaking the very foundation of my understanding of our life together. It wasn't just the moments of concealment. It was the absence of connection, the invisible gap that had formed between us while I thought everything was fine. I walked to the living room, seeking some clarity. The house was empty. She was probably in the bedroom, resting. I sat on the couch and let my thoughts drift. I thought about the wedding, the vows we had made, the dreams we had shared. And then I thought about the last few months. The way her presence seemed lighter, yet heavier at the same time, like she was carrying something she couldn't share. I remembered the first time I had noticed the distance. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no shouting, no clear indication that something was wrong. It was subtle, a look she gave me that lingered too long, a sigh too deep, a quiet pause in conversation. I remembered convincing myself that I was overthinking, that I was imagining tension that didn't exist. And now, I realized that overthinking had been the only thing keeping me from seeing the truth all along. I wanted to confront her. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to know if the child she carried was mine, to know if she had truly been faithful to herself, to us. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because part of me was afraid of what the answers might be. Part of me feared that knowing everything would shatter the fragile remnants of trust we had rebuilt after the first confession. Part of me feared that I would lose her entirely, not to another person, but to the weight of her own secrets. Days blurred into each other. Each morning, I woke up and saw her asleep beside me, so close yet so distant. Each evening, she would retreat into herself, lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. And each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to map the gaps between us, trying to understand the invisible fractures that had formed in our life. I began noticing the small things more than ever. The way she would sometimes hum softly to herself when she thought I wasn't listening. The way her fingers would drape over the edge of a chair when she was tired. The quiet way she would glance at the window, sometimes at nothing, sometimes at everything. These small details, once comforting, even mundane, now felt like clues, fragments of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Then came the first real confrontation, not one I planned, but one I could no longer avoid. It was a quiet night, the kind where everything in the house seems amplified. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a mug of tea that had gone cold. The only light came from the small lamp on the counter, casting long shadows across the floor. I entered the room slowly, trying not to startle her. "I can't do this anymore," I said. The words escaped before I could stop them. They weren't loud. They weren't angry. They were just true. She looked up, startled. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as fragile as I had ever seen her. "Do what?" she whispered. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "The silence. The distance. The secrets. The uncertainty. I can't pretend everything is fine anymore when it's not." She didn't speak. She only looked down at her hands. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. She was scared. Scared of the same thing I was. Scared of what admitting the truth could do to our lives. Scared of losing the one person who had promised to stand by her no matter what. I sat down across from her. We didn't speak for a long time. Just stared at each other, both of us weighing every word we could say, every reaction we might provoke, every possibility we had been avoiding. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." "I don't either," I said. And it was the honest truth. I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us. I didn't know how to untangle the threads of fear, guilt, and doubt that had wound themselves around our hearts. She nodded, a quiet acceptance in her eyes. Not relief, not surrender, just acknowledgement. We sat like that for hours. Not touching, not speaking, just existing in the same space, facing the reality that our lives had shifted in ways we couldn't control. And yet, despite everything, despite the fear, the pain, the secrets, I felt a small thread of something enduring. The recognition that we were still here, still present, still willing, in some quiet way, to try, to hold on, to see if love could survive even this. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be the love story I once imagined when I first saw her walk down the aisle. But it was real. And maybe, just maybe, reality, messy, complicated, painful, and fragile, was enough. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The sunlight spilled into the bedroom, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like it had to force its way through the tension that had settled over us, trying to reach something buried deep beneath the surface. I watched her sleeping for a moment. Her face was calm, serene even, but I could see the faint traces of worry in the way her brows were slightly furrowed. Even in rest, she carried weight that I could feel across the bed. I got up quietly and made coffee, trying to keep the noise down, not wanting to disturb her fragile rest. But as I stood at the counter, I realized how much I had changed in the past few weeks. My patience had grown thinner. My trust had become cautious. My mind was always calculating, questioning, doubting. I found myself replaying small moments, reading into every glance, every word, every hesitation. And even though I hated to admit it, I had become afraid of what I might discover if I stopped analyzing, afraid of what I would feel if I let myself relax. When she finally stirred and emerged from the bedroom, she smiled weakly. "Morning," she whispered. Her voice was soft, as if even speaking had required effort. "Morning," I replied. There was no warmth in my tone, but I didn't notice it until she flinched slightly, like she sensed my distance. We sat at the table in silence, sipping coffee, watching the steam curl from our mugs. She seemed tentative, as if measuring every word she might say, afraid to say too much or too little. I wanted to ask her everything, to confront her with every fear and suspicion I carried. But I didn't, because part of me knew that confrontation would break something beyond repair, and another part of me still held on to hope, fragile, desperate hope, that we could somehow navigate this together. After breakfast, she suggested we go for a walk. I agreed, though my heart wasn't entirely in it. The air outside was crisp, and the leaves had started to change, turning shades of amber and gold that reminded me of past autumns we had shared together. But even as I breathed in the scent of falling leaves and damp earth, the tension between us felt like a wall I couldn't see past. We walked side by side, the silence between us heavy but not hostile. She occasionally glanced at me, as if testing whether I would reach out, whether I would speak, whether I would cross the line into asking what she wasn't ready to answer. And every time she looked at me, I felt a pang of longing and fear. Longing for the woman I remembered, fear of the woman I was slowly learning she had become. She finally spoke after what felt like miles of quiet. "Do you ever feel like we're living in two different worlds?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the effort she had put into keeping it steady. I looked at her, searching for the right words. Every day, I admitted. Sometimes it feels like you're here, but not really here. Like you're somewhere I can't reach. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away before they fell. I don't mean to be distant, she said softly. I don't mean to hide things from you. I don't know how to deal with everything inside me, and I don't want to hurt you more. The truth of that sentence hit me harder than anything before. It wasn't just about the betrayal, the secrecy, or the mistakes. It was about the fear, the guilt, the weight she carried alone, and how long I had been blind to it. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I felt her pain, that I would carry some of it with her, but the words felt too small, too inadequate. We walked for hours without speaking again. The world around us was beautiful, filled with color and light, but it didn't penetrate the heaviness between us. And yet, somewhere in that silence, I felt the faintest thread of connection, a small spark of hope that maybe we weren't completely lost. When we returned home, she went straight to her room, leaving me alone in the living room. I sat there, staring at the walls, thinking about everything she had said and everything she hadn't. My mind kept circling the same questions. Was the child mine? Was she being honest about the one night that changed everything? Could I forgive her? Could I trust her again? And most terrifying of all, could we survive this? That evening, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. I didn't know what compelled me to do it, but I walked over and sat beside her. She didn't move away. She didn't speak. She just let me sit there, letting our bodies share space without words, letting the silence between us become a fragile kind of comfort. I don't want to lose you, she whispered again, and the repetition of those words made my chest ache. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold her close and tell her that everything would be okay. But I didn't. Not yet. Because love, I had learned, wasn't enough to erase the fractures that had formed between us. Instead, I said, softly, I don't want to lose us either. But we need to be honest, with each other, and with ourselves. Her hands shook slightly as she raised them to touch mine. I will try, she said. I promise I will try. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And for the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, in the slow, painful, and messy process of facing our truths, we could find a way back to each other. Because love, real love, isn't always clean. It isn't always easy. It isn't always safe. Sometimes it's terrifying. Sometimes it hurts more than it heals. But sometimes, if two people are willing to hold on and face the darkness together, it can survive even the deepest cracks. That night, we lay in bed facing each other for the first time in weeks. Her hand found mine, and I held it gently. Not tightly, not possessively, just enough to let her know I was there. She rested her head against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her body and her trust in a way that both scared and comforted me. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know what the weeks ahead would hold. I didn't know if the child would be mine, or if the bond between us could be repaired fully. But I knew one thing. We were still here, still present, still willing, at least in some small way, to fight for each other. And sometimes, in life, that's enough to begin rebuilding what was broken. The following days were not easy, but they were honest in a way that felt new. She began speaking more, cautiously at first, then with a little more ease. She told me about the moments she had hidden from me, not just the mistakes, but the fears, the sleepless nights, the sadness that had quietly built inside her. I listened without judgment, without interruption, just letting her words fill the spaces between us that had grown so painfully silent. I realized that for weeks, I had been angry at the shadows in our life, at the betrayals and omissions, at the uncertainty of it all. But sitting there, listening to her quietly pour out the truth, I understood that what had scared her most wasn't me. It was the thought that she might lose herself in my disappointment, the fear that she would be unlovable if I knew all the pieces of her brokenness. We didn't solve everything in those days. The questions about trust, fidelity, and the future still lingered in the air like smoke that refused to disperse. But there was a shift, a fragile, tentative shift, that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. It wasn't about perfection, or never making mistakes, or always knowing what to do. It was about presence, about connection, about the willingness to face life's darkness together rather than alone. One evening, She sat beside me on the couch, resting her head against my shoulder without hesitation. I could feel her warmth, her breath, the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat. I didn't pull away. I let the moment stretch, let the silence speak what words could not. And in that silence, I realized that love wasn't the absence of mistakes. It was the courage to confront them, the courage to remain, the courage to forgive, and the courage to rebuild. I didn't have all the answers yet. I didn't know if the fractures in our life could ever be fully mended. I didn't know if the child she carried was mine, or how the shadows of the past might echo in the years to come. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet peace settle inside me. Not complete peace, not naive peace, but a peace born from honesty, from effort, from the knowledge that we were willing to try. We went to bed that night side by side, closer than we had been in a long time. Her hand found mine, and I held it, letting her weight and her trust sink into me. And as we lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment. Life, love, marriage, they are not defined by perfection. They are defined by persistence, by moments of vulnerability, by the courage to face the truth together, no matter how painful. And though the future remained uncertain, though the road ahead promised challenges, I knew this. We had chosen to stay. We had chosen to face the pain, to speak the truths, to carry the weight together. And that choice, as fragile and tentative as it was, felt like the first step toward something real again. Because sometimes, surviving the darkest nights means simply being willing to remain in the same room, to listen, to breathe, and to hold on. And that night, as I drifted into sleep with her hand in mine, I felt that perhaps, just perhaps, holding on was enough to begin again. The days after that night felt different. Not magically better, not free of the weight that had been pressing on us for weeks, but different. There was a quiet acknowledgement between us now, unspoken but undeniable, a fragile agreement that we would try to speak, try to listen, try to remain present with each other, even when it hurt. I noticed small changes in her behavior. She no longer hid in rooms for hours. She no longer avoided my gaze. She laughed softly again, sometimes at things only we could understand. And though the air was still thick with the tension of unspoken questions, there was also a subtle lightness, a reminder that even broken things can start to breathe again if treated with care. Then came the day we had to face another truth, one we had both been avoiding for too long. She was quiet in the morning, unusually quiet, sitting at the kitchen table staring at her mug. I could feel that familiar tension, the way it gathers in the chest before something changes. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice soft and hesitant. I felt my stomach tighten. I had been preparing for this moment in some small way, imagining the words she might speak, rehearsing the ways I could respond, but nothing could truly prepare me for the weight of reality. She took a deep breath. "The baby. I found out yesterday. I'm pregnant." The word hung in the air between us. It should have been a moment of joy, a shared excitement, but the truth made it heavy, complicated. I swallowed hard, unsure what to feel first: fear, hope, confusion, relief, love, or despair. "Are you sure?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I expected. She nodded. "Yes, I went to the doctor yesterday. Everything is fine, but it changes everything, doesn't it?" It did change everything. Suddenly, the abstract questions, the fears, the mistrust, the cracks in our life, they were all magnified, intensified, impossible to ignore. And yet, somewhere inside, a spark of hope flickered. Maybe this child could be a bridge between us. Maybe this tiny life, innocent and untainted, could help us heal. But the truth was more complicated. I didn't know if the child was mine. I couldn't. The thought that the night she had told me about, the night with him, might have contributed to this life was something I couldn't ignore. I loved her. I wanted to trust her. But my mind couldn't stop calculating, questioning, imagining the worst, and hoping for the best all at once. She reached for my hand, tentative, almost afraid. "I want us to figure this out," she whispered. "I don't want to lose you. I want us to do this together." Her words cut me in a way I couldn't explain. Not because they weren't sincere, but because they were both comforting and terrifying. We were standing at the edge of something huge, something that could either break us completely or bind us in ways we had never known before. I nodded, though I didn't know if my agreement meant anything beyond the desire to hold on. I had no answers. I had no roadmap. I had only the knowledge that I still loved her, that I wanted to remain present, and that somehow we had to navigate the uncertainty together. The following weeks were a delicate dance. We attended doctor appointments together. We discussed names quietly in the evenings. We laughed softly, held hands when the world felt too heavy, and occasionally argued over small things that felt insignificant but were magnified by the tension that still lingered. Sometimes, I caught myself watching her as she went about her day, trying to read her expressions, trying to understand whether she still carried guilt, whether she still carried fear. I wanted to believe she was fully present with me, fully committed to this second chance, but the question lingered in every glance, every hesitation, every quiet pause. One evening, as the sun was setting, she came into the living room carrying a stack of baby clothes. The tiny onesies and socks, folded neatly, were almost absurd in their smallness against the enormity of what we faced. She held them up, smiling softly. "Can you believe it?" she whispered. "It's real. Someone's going to need these soon." I nodded, swallowing hard. My heart felt heavy, but also strangely full. Seeing her with the tiny clothes, imagining this new life growing inside her, made the fear and uncertainty blend with hope. Maybe we could survive this. Maybe we could rebuild. Maybe we could learn to trust again. But even as I held that fragile hope, a shadow lingered. The memory of that night, the secrecy, the betrayal, it was not something that could be erased. It was a part of our history now, a silent thread that ran through everything. And I knew that the days ahead would demand honesty, patience, and courage from both of us in ways we had never experienced before. That night, we lay together in bed. She rested her head on my chest, and I felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing. I placed a hand over her belly, feeling the faintest movement inside her, and it struck me how fragile and miraculous life could be. This child, this little being growing between us, represented both a challenge and a gift. It demanded that we confront our truths, face our fears, and choose each other again and again, every day. I realized that love, even after betrayal, even after doubt and silence, could survive if it was tended to with care. It would not be easy. It would not be perfect. But it could exist, fragile and luminous, in the spaces where honesty and presence met. And as I drifted into sleep that night, holding her close, I made a silent promise to myself and to her. No matter what came next, no matter the uncertainties, the revelations, or the fears, I would try. I would remain present. I would face every shadow with her, as long as she was willing to walk beside me. Because sometimes, survival isn't about grand gestures or sudden clarity. It's about showing up, day after day, in small ways that matter. And sometimes, that is enough to begin healing. The days that followed the announcement of the pregnancy were a strange mix of hope and fear. On one hand, there was this undeniable excitement, the idea of a new life, of a future that we could shape together. But on the other hand, every step felt fragile, like walking on thin ice over a dark lake. One wrong move, one careless word, and everything could collapse. I found myself watching her constantly, noticing the smallest changes. The way she walked more carefully, as if protecting something invisible. The way she sometimes rubbed her stomach absent-mindedly, almost apologetically, like she was trying to make up for the past. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was okay, that we could face everything together. But every time I opened my mouth, doubt stopped me. What if my words carried suspicion, even unintentionally? What if my tone reminded her of the fractures between us instead of the love that still lingered? She started talking more about the future. Names, colors for the nursery, the way she imagined holding the baby for the first time. I listened, contributing where I could, but there was a quiet hesitation in both of us. The silence that followed our conversations wasn't empty. It was loaded with unspoken questions. Who is the child? Can we trust each other fully? How much of our life is reparable? I tried to remind myself that hope could exist alongside uncertainty, that love could survive even the cracks we hadn't repaired. I wanted to believe it desperately, but I also felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on me with every glance at her, every soft laugh, every whisper of "I love you" that seemed to come with a shadow I couldn't name. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in orange and gold. She sat beside me on the couch, her hand resting on her stomach. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and longing, as if asking silently whether I would stay. I reached out and took her hand, holding it gently. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "I am too." We sat together in silence for a long time. The only sounds the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the clock. And in that silence, I realized something important. Fear didn't have to be a wall between us. It could be a bridge if we let it. If we allowed ourselves to be honest, to be vulnerable, to show each other our weaknesses without judgment. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Not completely healed, not perfectly whole, but a sense that we were still here, still willing to face the unknown together. The nights became the hardest. Lying beside her, feeling the life growing inside her, I couldn't escape the questions that haunted me. Was the child mine? Could I forgive the past fully? Could we trust each other again in a way that would survive the pressures to come? I held her hand, hoping that somehow, the act of presence could carry us through the uncertainty. And yet, in the quiet of those nights, I noticed how fragile we both were. Every shadow in the room, every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound outside felt magnified. Our life together had shifted in ways we couldn't ignore. And the truth was clear. The road ahead would demand more honesty, patience, and courage than we had ever had to summon before. One morning, she woke me early, her eyes filled with an unusual intensity. "I had a dream," she whispered, her voice trembling, "about the baby, about us. And I think it's telling me something I need to say." I listened carefully, bracing myself for what was coming. Dreams, I realized, often held truths that the conscious mind avoided. And in her voice, I heard the echo of fear and hope intertwined. "I can't do this alone," she admitted. "I've been trying, but I need you, really need you, to be with me, not just beside me. I need you to face this with me. No half measures, no secrets. I can't keep carrying the past and the future and the fear all by myself." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. She wasn't asking me to forgive blindly, nor was she asking me to forget. She was asking me to choose her again, to choose us every day, in spite of the fractures, in spite of the uncertainty. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. Love isn't just an emotion. It's a decision, a constant, deliberate choice to remain, to listen, to fight for something fragile and real. I took her hand in both of mine. "I choose you," I said softly. "I'll face this with you. Every step, no matter how hard it gets." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't just sorrow, they were relief. And maybe even a hint of hope. For the first time in weeks, I believed that we might survive this. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past could be erased, but because we had chosen, together, to confront it, to face the unknown, and to hold on, no matter what. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Every conversation, every glance, every small action carried weight. I found myself hyper-aware of her moods, of the subtle shifts in her tone, the way she held her hands, the way she moved through the house. It wasn't paranoia, at least, I tried to convince myself of that. It was a heightened sense of presence, the kind that comes from knowing the stakes are higher than they've ever been. She was careful too. I could see it in the way she smiled, the way she spoke. She no longer hid away, but she carried a quiet vigilance, as if testing me constantly, seeing if I could truly meet her where she was. And I tried. I tried with every ounce of patience I had. I tried to listen without judgment. I tried to respond with honesty, not anger, not fear, not accusation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the clouds, she came to me with a stack of papers. Her hands trembled slightly, and I could see her fighting the urge to retreat into silence. She handed them to me quietly. "I thought we needed to see everything clearly," she said. I took the papers. They were records, documents, even letters I hadn't seen before. Things from her past she had been keeping hidden, not secrets meant to hurt me, but truths she hadn't known how to share. I scanned them slowly. Each one was a reminder that we were not starting fresh. We were rebuilding on a foundation that had been fractured, and if we were to survive, we had to confront every piece of it, no matter how uncomfortable. She watched me nervously. I'm "I'm sorry for not telling you sooner," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose you, but I see now that hiding doesn't protect love. It only makes the fractures worse." Her words struck me. I could see her fear, her shame, but I could also see the courage it took to finally speak them. And I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from understanding, from choosing to remain, from deciding that the person you love is worth the effort, even after the worst has been revealed. We spent that night going through each document, each truth, piece by piece. We spoke in quiet voices, sometimes pausing for long stretches to simply absorb what had been said, to process what had been revealed. It was exhausting. It was painful, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I felt a flicker of hope. By the end of the night, we were both drained, physically and emotionally, but there was a new connection, a fragile, tentative thread that had begun to weave itself between us. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't strong yet, but it existed, and that was enough to carry us into the uncertain days ahead. We went to bed later than usual, wrapped in the quiet understanding that we had survived another confrontation. We held each other without words, feeling the rhythm of our hearts, the warmth of our bodies, the shared weight of the past, and the unknown future. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love could survive even the deepest fractures, if nurtured, if tended to with patience, courage, and unwavering presence. As I drifted to sleep, I realized that our journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more fears, more revelations. But the choice we had made, to remain, to face the truth, to hold on, was the first step toward rebuilding. And in that choice, I found a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. Because sometimes, surviving isn't about fixing everything at once. Sometimes, it's about choosing each other again and again, even when the path is uncertain and the future is unclear. And that night, as we lay together in silence, I knew that this choice, fragile, tentative, imperfect, was the only thing that could carry us forward. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance between hope and fear. Every morning, I woke up looking at her, trying to measure what was real and what was still shadowed by the past. She carried her growing belly with a quiet determination, and I tried to carry my own uncertainty the same way, with care, with patience, with as much courage as I could muster. But the cracks we thought were mending revealed themselves in new ways. She became quieter in moments when I expected laughter. Her eyes would sometimes drift toward the window, toward nothing, and I could see a hesitation I couldn't name. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, to reach across the distance, but every question felt heavy, potentially dangerous, like touching a fragile thread that could unravel everything we had worked to hold together. One night, the tension became unbearable. She came into the living room, her hands trembling slightly, carrying a letter. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from him. From the man whose presence had shattered the foundation of our marriage, whose memory still lingered like smoke in the corners of every room. I didn't know if I should tell you, she whispered, her voice tight, but I can't keep hiding it. I took the letter from her hands. My chest tightened. Every instinct in me screamed to throw it away, to erase it, to pretend it didn't exist. But the truth doesn't disappear by ignoring it. I opened it slowly, carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I read the words he had written. He spoke of regret, of missed opportunities, of longing. He claimed he wanted to be part of her life again, despite everything. I looked at her, searching her face for an explanation, a hint of deception, a sign that this was some trap I wasn't aware of. But all I saw was fear, and guilt, and vulnerability. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the world had pressed her into herself. "We need to talk," I said softly. Not accusing, not angry, just truthfully. I didn't know what the next words would be, but I knew we had reached another turning point. She nodded. We sat down together, the letter between us like a third presence in the room. I didn't know whether to read more, to ask questions, or to simply sit in silence and let the tension stretch between us until it broke. Finally, she spoke. "I never wanted him back. I never will. But he's trying to contact me, to interfere. I don't know why now, but I don't want him involved. I want this child, our family, to be ours. But I can't do it alone. I need you with me." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. My heart ached. but there was clarity beneath the pain. This was the moment we had been preparing for, the moment when every lingering fear, every ounce of mistrust, every shadow from the past had to be confronted head-on. "I'm here," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my chest. "We'll face this together. No one comes between us. No one. Not him. Not the past. Nothing. I promise you." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't just fear or guilt. They were relief. And in that moment, the weight that had been pressing on both of us for weeks seemed just a little lighter. Not gone, but manageable, because we were choosing each other again. The following days were tense, but purposeful. We spoke openly, setting boundaries, discussing what was acceptable and what wasn't. She reassured me repeatedly, and I listened, not just to her words, but to her tone, her expressions, her body language. Trust was no longer something I could take for granted. It had to be rebuilt moment by moment, day by day, decision by decision. And in that slow, careful rebuilding, I began to notice a change, not just in her, but in myself. My fear began to coexist with hope. My doubt began to be tempered by trust. I realized that survival after betrayal wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it, together, with courage and presence. One evening, as she rested against my chest, I felt her hand on her belly and mine over it. I thought about the child, the life growing between us, and I realized that this little life wasn't just a responsibility. It was a chance. A chance to forgive, to rebuild, to choose love every day, in spite of the fractures and fears. And for the first time in months, I truly believed that we could survive the storms ahead. Not because everything would be easy, not because the past would disappear, but because we were choosing to face it together. And that choice, deliberate, imperfect, courageous, was everything. The next few weeks were a test I had never imagined we would face. Every day felt like walking through a storm with no shelter in sight. His letters, his messages, the faint traces of his presence. They weren't constant, but they were enough to stir unease, to provoke fear, to remind us of the fragility of everything we were trying to hold together. She became more anxious, pacing the house sometimes, her hands trembling over her stomach as if she could shield the child from the chaos she felt surrounding us. I watched her closely, wanting to protect her, wanting to shield her from worry, but I knew I couldn't. All I could do was stand beside her, silently, letting my presence speak louder than words. One night, I found her sitting on the floor of the nursery, the tiny crib assembled but empty. She was holding a small onesie in her hands, her fingers tracing the fabric as though memorizing it. I knelt beside her, unsure what to say. I don't know if I can handle him trying to come back into our lives," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've made mistakes before. I don't want to make more, but I'm scared." I took her hand in mine. "You won't have to face this alone," I said softly. "I'll be here. Every step, every challenge. We face this together." She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes, and for a moment, I saw the fragile hope that had been buried under fear for weeks. She leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, and I held her, letting the weight of her fear rest against me, letting it mingle with my own uncertainty. The days became a careful balance between normalcy and vigilance. We prepared for the baby, folding tiny clothes, arranging the nursery, discussing names, and imagining the moments we would share as a family. Yet beneath it all, a quiet tension persisted, a shadow that reminded us that healing wasn't linear and that trust had to be earned every single day. One afternoon, a message arrived from him again. It was brief, almost casual, but the implications were clear. He wanted to see her, to talk, to rekindle something he had no right to. I saw the fear flash in her eyes, and I knew that this was the moment we had to draw a line, together. "We can't let him in," I said firmly. "Not now, not ever. This is our life, our child, our family. We protect that first. Everything else comes second." She nodded, relief and gratitude mixing with lingering anxiety. "I know. I hate feeling afraid all the time." "I know," I said again, holding her close. "But fear is only powerful if we let it control us. We won't let it. We face it together. Always." And in that shared promise, I felt something shift inside both of us. Not all the fear disappeared, not all the uncertainty vanished, but a quiet determination began to grow. We were no longer just surviving the past. We were actively choosing each other, actively building a life that could withstand the shadows lingering around us. That night, I lay beside her, feeling her hand on her belly, imagining the life growing inside her. I realized that this child, this small, fragile life, was a reminder of resilience, a chance to start anew, to rebuild trust, and to create a family despite the fractures we had endured. And as we drifted into sleep together, I understood that our journey wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the fear didn't exist. It was about presence, about courage, about love that chooses again and again, even when it hurts, even when the outcome is uncertain. Because in the end, survival isn't measured by the absence of struggle. It's measured by the willingness to remain, to face the storm, and to hold on, to each other, and to the fragile hope that tomorrow can be better. The tension reached a point where even ordinary moments felt charged. Every sound outside the house, every unexpected knock, every phone notification made my chest tighten. I noticed how she flinched sometimes, how her eyes darted toward the door or her phone, and I realized just how much fear had crept into our daily lives. It wasn't enough to ruin us, but it was enough to remind us that the past was still very much alive. One evening, the moment came we had both been quietly anticipating, the confrontation. He had called again, leaving a message that was veiled in casualness but dripping with expectation, the kind that implied he believed he still had a claim to her, to our life, to what we were building together. I played the message once, then twice, listening not just to his words but to the threat behind them, the sense that he thought he could undo months of rebuilding with a few carefully chosen sentences. She sat beside me, her hand in mine, trembling slightly. "I don't know why he's doing this," she whispered. "I thought he had moved on." I squeezed her hand. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is that we decide what this means for us. Together. No one interferes in our life, our family, without both of us agreeing to it." That night, we prepared ourselves. Not for anger, not for violence, but for clarity, for boundaries, for the moment when we would stand united, unafraid, and confront the past with courage rather than fear. The next day, when he arrived unannounced, I felt the familiar tension squeeze my chest. She stepped forward, her posture straight but her eyes wary. I followed, standing behind her, silent but firm. He greeted us casually, as if nothing had happened, but I could see the underlying tension, the expectation, the challenge. I didn't speak immediately. I let her take the lead. She looked at him, her voice steady but quiet. "This is over," she said. "Whatever you think, whatever you hope, whatever you believe, you are not part of this life. Not anymore. We are choosing each other. Our child. Our family. You have no place here." I saw the surprise flash across his face, followed by a flicker of anger that quickly passed. He opened his mouth, but I stepped forward gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's true," I said calmly, not threatening, not shouting. "Whatever history you think exists, it doesn't give you the right to interfere. She is with me. We are a family, and we will protect what we're building, together." The air was thick, heavy with everything unsaid, every shadow of the past, every fear that had haunted us for months. He realized in that moment that we were no longer fractured. We were standing together, united, and no words or threats could undo the bond we had chosen to reaffirm. He left eventually, quietly, defeated not by confrontation, but by the undeniable truth that our life was ours and ours alone. And as the door closed behind him, I felt a weight lift, not completely, not instantly, but a weight nonetheless. We returned to the quiet of our home, the only sounds the soft hum of the heater and the distant whisper of wind outside. She rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers tracing gentle circles on my hand. I placed my other hand over her stomach, feeling the subtle movements of the life growing inside her. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe fully. Not because the past was erased, not because fear was gone, but because we had faced it together. We had chosen each other in the face of doubt, in the face of fear, and in the face of threats to everything we were building. And in that choice, in that quiet act of remaining present, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. Love, real love, isn't defined by perfection or absence of fear. It's defined by the courage to face the storm, together, to protect what matters most, and to keep choosing each other no matter what shadows the past may cast. That night, as we lay together, hands intertwined, I felt the fragile yet powerful pulse of hope. It wasn't naive, it wasn't complete, but it was ours. And sometimes, that is all it takes to begin truly rebuilding. After the confrontation, the house felt different. Lighter, somehow, though the weight of the past still lingered like a faint shadow in the corners. It wasn't that fear or uncertainty had vanished. They never truly do. But the air between us was clearer, filled with the quiet strength of shared resolve. We had faced the threat together, and in doing so, we had reaffirmed something far more important: our commitment to each other, to the child, and to the life we were rebuilding. In the days that followed, we fell into a careful rhythm. Mornings were slow and deliberate, filled with small routines that brought a sense of normalcy. Coffee together, folding baby clothes, imagining the tiny life growing inside her. Even simple tasks felt profound now because they were acts of preservation, acts of love, and acts of courage. We spoke more openly than we had in months. Every lingering fear, every lingering doubt, was aired gently, patiently, without judgment. Sometimes the conversations were painful, digging into old wounds, old betrayals, old insecurities. But each time, we emerged with a little more understanding, a little more trust, a little more proof that we could survive the difficult truths if we faced them together. One evening, she rested her head on my chest, and I placed a hand over her belly. The life growing there was a constant reminder of what we were fighting for, not just survival, but renewal, possibility, and hope. "I can't imagine doing this without you," she whispered. "You don't have to," I replied. "I'm here, always." And in that quiet exchange, I realized how much we had grown, not apart, as I had feared, but closer, in ways that only struggle and shared vulnerability can teach. We had faced betrayal, uncertainty, and fear, and yet here we were, choosing each other again, choosing love despite the fractures, despite the lingering shadows. We learned that survival doesn't require perfection. It doesn't demand that the past be erased or that every doubt vanish. Survival and love are acts of decision, repeated endlessly. It's about showing up, day after day, holding each other through uncertainty, and trusting that the bond we nurture can withstand even the deepest cracks. That night, as I held her close, feeling the quiet stirrings of our child within her, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Life will always be unpredictable. People will make mistakes, and betrayal may visit even the strongest relationships. But what defines a family, what defines love, isn't the absence of hardship. It's the courage to remain present, to face the darkness together, and to choose each other, again and again, no matter how uncertain the path may seem. I closed my eyes, letting the steady rhythm of her breathing and the life inside her lull me into a rare sense of peace. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, we had each other. We had hope. We had a fragile but unbreakable choice to continue, to heal, and to build something real. And sometimes I realized that is enough. The following weeks felt like a slow awakening. Life was beginning to move forward in a way that felt both fragile and hopeful. Every morning, I would wake and watch her sleeping, her hand resting gently on her stomach, the faint rise and fall of her breath a quiet reminder of the life growing inside her. I had never realized before how profound the presence of a small life could be, how it could both anchor you and demand that you confront everything you had avoided, everything you had feared. She was radiant in ways that went beyond appearance. There was a soft glow in her eyes, a gentleness in her movements, a quiet patience that had not been there before. But beneath it all, I could sense the tension she carried, the fear of repeating mistakes, the weight of guilt from the past, the uncertainty of what the future would bring. I wanted to take it all from her, to hold it, to protect her from every shadow, but I knew that some of it she had to carry herself, and I had to be there simply to bear witness, to support, to remain steady. Our conversations changed in tone and depth. We spoke about hopes for the baby, names we liked, the colors of the nursery, the tiny details that once seemed insignificant but now carried enormous weight. We laughed quietly, sometimes at our own indecision or silly disagreements about what tiny outfit would be first worn. Those small moments felt like acts of defiance against the fear and the fractures that had haunted us for months. They reminded me that life, even in its most ordinary forms, could still hold beauty, intimacy, and connection. Yet, every day was also a careful negotiation with the past. There were moments when I would see her hesitate, moments when she flinched at a sound or a shadow, moments when her eyes would betray a lingering anxiety. I wanted to ask, to probe, to demand clarity, but I knew that trust could not be forced. It had to grow slowly, like a plant pushed into the light. And so I learned to hold my own fears, to contain them, to let her feel safe enough to continue healing. I began to notice changes in myself too. My anger had softened, replaced by a cautious empathy. My skepticism had not disappeared, but it had begun to coexist with hope. I realized that love, after betrayal, was not about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to remain despite it. It was about being present when everything inside you wanted to retreat. And in choosing to remain, day after day, I found a strength I had not known I possessed. As her belly grew, so did our connection. I would place my hand over her stomach, feeling the subtle movements, the occasional kicks, and I felt a rush of protective instinct I had never experienced before. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about this new life, this fragile being that depended on both of us, whether we were ready or not. I spoke to the baby sometimes, softly, telling it about the world, about us, about how we were going to face life together, despite mistakes, despite fears. And sometimes, I imagined the future, bright and terrifying, and allowed myself to hope that we could survive it, together. She was learning too. She spoke more openly about her own fears, the fear of being an unworthy mother, the fear that the past might somehow shadow the future, the fear that our fragile trust could break again. I listened, not interrupting, not judging, letting her words flow freely. And in those moments, I realized that love was as much about listening as it was about speaking, as much about patience as it was about passion. The household became a space of careful preparation. We painted the nursery, choosing soft colors that felt warm and inviting. We assembled furniture, folding tiny clothes, imagining what it would be like to hold this child for the first time. Every act felt sacred, filled with intention and meaning. Even the mundane chores carried a weight of significance, because each one was an affirmation that we were choosing to build life together, rather than let the past define us. We also began to reconnect with friends and family, slowly reintroducing ourselves to the world outside our home. Each interaction was a small test, a gentle reminder that the world was still there, and that it could not touch the fragile bubble of safety and hope we were creating. Sometimes, I felt the old tension rising, a whisper of fear that others might judge, or that our past might follow us. But in those moments, I reminded myself that our family, our trust, our child, these were ours to protect, and no one else's opinion could diminish their value. There were nights, however, when the old wounds returned with full force. I would lie awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the betrayals, the mistakes, the uncertainty that had almost torn us apart. Sometimes the fear of losing her, or the fear of being betrayed again, would feel overwhelming. But then I would reach over, feel her hand on mine, feel the subtle shift of the baby moving beneath her skin, and I would remind myself that we had survived worse. We had faced shadows together, and we were still here. That knowledge became a quiet anchor in the storm of uncertainty. We began to talk about the future more openly, imagining life beyond the pregnancy, imagining the kind of parents we wanted to be, the kind of family we wanted to create. We spoke of routines, values, and small moments of joy we hoped to preserve. And in those conversations, I found the courage to forgive, not because the past was excusable, but because the future demanded it. Forgiveness was no longer a choice. It was a necessity if we were to move forward, if we were to nurture life together, if we were to survive. Every day became a lesson in patience, presence, and resilience. The pregnancy progressed with its small triumphs and challenges, and we faced them together: doctor visits, sleepless nights, the occasional worry that something might go wrong. And through it all, I saw her strength, her courage, her vulnerability, and I loved her more deeply than I had thought possible. Not blindly, not without caution, but fully, deliberately, and consciously. As the months passed, the anticipation of meeting our child grew. We would lie awake at night, speaking softly to each other, imagining the first cry, the first smile, the first steps. Every plan carried the weight of hope and responsibility, and every imagined moment became a promise we were making to each other and to the life we were creating. And in those quiet nights, holding her hand, feeling the life within her, I realized a profound truth. Love after betrayal is not linear, it is not simple, and it is not easy. But it can exist, fragile and luminous, if nurtured with patience, honesty, courage, and unwavering presence. And sometimes, that is enough to begin healing, enough to rebuild trust, enough to create a life that carries the weight of the past, but reaches toward the light of the future. As the pregnancy advanced, the rhythm of our days began to feel more defined, more purposeful. Mornings were quieter, softer. We would make coffee together, speak in hushed tones, and sometimes just sit in silence, letting the presence of each other and the life growing inside her fill the room. Those silences were no longer empty. They were full of understanding, empathy, and a tentative peace that we had not felt in months. I noticed the smallest details about her, how she sometimes rested her hand on her back when it ached, the gentle way she stretched in the mornings, the soft sighs when she felt the baby move. I watched her with awe, realizing how resilient she was, how capable of carrying both life and past mistakes, how strong yet vulnerable she could be at the same time. And I realized that my role was not to fix, not to control, but simply to witness, to support, to remain present without judgment. We started reading together, books about parenthood, stories about families, little guides about what to expect. Sometimes we laughed at the absurdity of some advice, and sometimes we grew silent, letting the reality of what was coming sink in. Every chapter we read became a small bridge, connecting us not just to knowledge, but to the shared responsibility and shared hope for the future. There were still moments of doubt, moments when fear and past mistakes crept back into the quiet spaces. Sometimes I would see her hesitate, and I would feel the old tension coil inside me. Sometimes I would catch myself imagining worst-case scenarios. What if the past repeated itself? What if trust broke again? What if I couldn't be enough for her or for the child? But each time, I would reach for her hand, feel the subtle movements beneath her skin, and remind myself that we had survived far worse. That presence, that choice to remain, was stronger than fear. We also began talking about the life we wanted after the baby arrived. Nights were filled with whispered plans about routines, small family traditions, and the values we wanted to pass on. We spoke about patience, honesty, and the lessons we had learned from our past mistakes. And in those conversations, I realized how much we had grown, not just individually, but as a couple. We were learning to communicate with intention, to listen with empathy, to trust with care. The physical changes were hard at times, and I could see how she struggled with discomfort, with the fatigue, with the emotional swings that came with carrying a life. I tried to be gentle, patient, and observant. I learned that love often isn't dramatic. It's in the quiet moments of holding a hand, rubbing a back, offering a warm drink, or simply staying present while someone else rests. And in those small gestures, I felt our connection deepen in ways I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, as she rested on the couch, she looked at me with a softness that made my chest ache. "I don't know what I did to deserve you staying," she whispered. "I know I broke things. I know I made mistakes. But you've stayed. You've chosen me, every day. I don't know if I can ever repay that." I shook my head, holding her hand firmly. "You don't need to repay anything. This is about us, about the life we're creating together. We can't erase the past, but we can shape the future. And right now, we're shaping it together." Her eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill. She leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. And in that moment, I realized that the past, the betrayals, the mistakes, the fear, was not the defining element of our lives. What mattered was this: presence, choice, and the willingness to rebuild, slowly, deliberately, with intention and care. We also began preparing the nursery more fully, folding tiny clothes, arranging the crib, choosing soft blankets, imagining the first moments when we would hold our child in our arms. Each small task was a reaffirmation of hope, a promise to the life inside her that we were committed, that we were ready, that we were choosing family, even in the face of everything that had tried to break us. Even the ordinary moments became sacred. Washing dishes together, sharing meals, sitting quietly in the evenings with music softly playing. These were the moments that stitched the frayed edges of our bond back together. I realized that love is often not found in grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. It is found in the quiet constancy of showing up, day after day, even when the past whispers doubts, even when fear lingers, even when the road ahead is uncertain. And through it all, the baby's movements reminded us of what we were working toward, what we were protecting. Every kick, every shift, every flutter was a heartbeat of hope, a reminder that despite mistakes, despite fear, despite the shadows of the past, life could be new again. And in that fragile, luminous presence, I found the courage to let go of lingering resentment, to embrace the imperfect, to trust the slow, careful process of rebuilding. We began to talk more openly about our mistakes, about the ways we had hurt each other, and about the ways we could do better. And in those conversations, I realized something profound. Trust is not a static state. It is a daily act, a continuous decision, a living choice that must be nurtured with honesty, patience, and unwavering presence. Sometimes I would lie awake at night, watching her sleep, thinking about the journey we had traveled together, the betrayals, the secrets, the fear, the pain, and I would marvel at how far we had come. We were not perfect. We were not free of scars, but we were together. And that, I realized, was more important than perfection. It was more important than erasing the past. It was more important than avoiding fear. Because survival, love, and family are not built on perfection. They are built on presence, on courage, on the willingness to face life together, day after day, choice after choice. And as I rested my hand on her belly, feeling the subtle movements of our child, I understood that this was the beginning of a new chapter. Not one without challenges, but one filled with hope, with connection, and with the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding something real. As the pregnancy entered its final months, every day felt both heavier and brighter. Heavier, because the responsibility of what we were creating, this tiny, fragile life, was impossible to ignore. Brighter, because with each passing day, the life inside her reminded me of hope, of renewal, and of the possibilities that existed beyond the mistakes of the past. I watched her closely, noticing the way she adjusted herself to find comfort, the way she sometimes sighed softly, and the quiet moments when she would close her eyes and just breathe. I wanted to take the weight from her shoulders, to carry it myself, but I knew that some things she had to experience fully as part of the journey. My role was to be present, to offer strength without smothering, to love without judgment, and to trust that the bond we were rebuilding could survive even the moments of fear and uncertainty. We spent long evenings imagining our child's first experiences, the first laugh, the first cry, the first time we would hold them in our arms. Sometimes we spoke softly to the baby, telling it about our hopes, about the love that had endured, about the courage it would inherit from us. And in those quiet moments, I felt a deep connection, not just to her, but to the life we were bringing into the world. At times, the past would creep back into our thoughts. I would remember the betrayal, the secrets, the nights of uncertainty, and the fear that I had once felt so acutely. She would sometimes flinch at a sound or hesitate in conversation, and I knew she carried her own ghosts. But instead of letting these moments fracture us, we began to use them as reminders, to speak more openly, to listen more carefully, and to reaffirm our commitment to each other and to the life we were creating. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch, her hands resting gently on her stomach, and she spoke softly. "I've been scared," she admitted. Scared that the past would define our future, scared that we wouldn't be able to trust each other fully, scared that I'd fail you, fail us, fail the baby. I took her hands in mine, holding them firmly but gently. "We can't erase the past," I said, "but we can face it together. Every fear, every doubt, we face it as a team. You don't have to carry anything alone." She leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I felt the tension between us begin to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. The journey we had taken, the mistakes, the betrayals, the fear, had not destroyed us. It had reshaped us, teaching us patience, empathy, and the deliberate act of choosing each other again and again. The nursery was finally ready, filled with soft colors, tiny clothes neatly folded, and the crib waiting patiently. Every detail, every decision had been made with intention, a testament to the love and hope we were nurturing together. Standing in that room, watching her trace her fingers over the crib rail, I realized that this was more than preparation, it was a declaration. We were ready to face the future, whatever it held, together. I began to speak to the baby more regularly, softly, reassuringly, telling it about the resilience of its parents, about the mistakes we had learned from, about the love that would surround it no matter what. And I realized that these small acts, these gentle, deliberate choices, were more than preparation for parenthood. They were a reaffirmation of trust, of forgiveness, and of the courage to love despite uncertainty. One night, lying beside her, I felt the baby move strongly for the first time, and I could sense a subtle shift in everything we had carried for months. That small life, inside her, was proof that growth, hope, and renewal were possible. It was proof that love could endure, that trust could be rebuilt, and that even after betrayal, life could find a way to flourish. And as I held her hand, feeling the tiny movements beneath her skin, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Forgiveness is not a moment, it is a journey. Trust is not granted once, it is nurtured, moment by moment, choice by choice. Love is not always effortless, it is deliberate, persistent, and courageous. We had survived storms together, faced shadows that could have torn us apart, and emerged with a fragile, luminous bond that promised hope. The pregnancy had become more than a waiting period. It had become a mirror, reflecting our growth, our resilience, and the deliberate choices we were making to create a life worth living. And in that quiet night, as we lay together, hands intertwined and hearts open, I felt an unshakable truth. The past may shape us, mistakes may haunt us, fear may linger, but love, when chosen and nurtured, has the power to transform, to heal, and to create a future we could never have imagined. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to hope without hesitation, and to trust that whatever came next, we would face it together, our family, our child, and the bond that had endured everything and would continue to endure long after the shadows had faded. The day finally arrived with a quiet intensity that I hadn't anticipated. The morning was soft, the light filtering through the curtains like a gentle promise. I watched her breathe deeply, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes filled with both fear and anticipation. I could see every emotion passing across her face: hope, anxiety, determination, and trust. And I realized that this moment was the culmination of everything we had endured, every choice we had made, every act of love and patience that had led us here. We arrived at the hospital with a mixture of calm and quiet nervousness. I held her hand in the car, feeling the strength beneath her vulnerability, the courage beneath her fear. I whispered softly, "We're here together. We've faced everything before, and we'll face this too. You're not alone." She nodded, squeezing my hand, and in that gesture, I felt a deep, unspoken understanding pass between us. The labor was long, slow, and at times grueling. I held her hand through every contraction, whispered encouragements, and simply stayed present, feeling the rhythm of her struggle and the life growing inside her. There were moments when fear threatened to overwhelm us, moments when exhaustion made every second feel like an eternity, and moments when I realized that no words could fully capture the gravity of what was happening. All I could do was remain, to be present, to be steady. And then, in a moment that felt suspended in time, our child was born. The first cry echoed through the room, a tiny, fragile sound that carried the weight of hope, the culmination of love, and the promise of a future that we had fought to reach. I looked at her, tears in my eyes, and she looked back at me, exhausted but radiant, and in that shared gaze, I saw everything we had endured reflected: the pain, the fear, the betrayal, the struggle, and the triumph of choosing each other over and over again. Holding our baby in my arms for the first time was overwhelming. The tiny body, so delicate and perfect, seemed impossibly small against the enormity of what it represented. A new beginning, a tangible proof that love could endure, that trust could be rebuilt, that life could continue even after the deepest fractures. I felt a surge of emotion so intense that words failed me. All I could do was breathe, hold, and marvel at the fragile miracle in my hands. She watched me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered softly, "We did it. We made it." I nodded, unable to speak, and she leaned into me, resting her head against my chest as we both looked at the life we had created together. In that moment, the past, the betrayals, the fear, the secrets, felt like a distant shadow. Not gone, not erased, but powerless in the face of what we had chosen, what we had built, what we were holding in our arms. In the days that followed, we settled into a rhythm that felt both terrifying and beautiful. Nights were long, filled with feedings, gentle rocking, and quiet moments of reflection. Days were filled with awe, laughter, and a profound sense of connection. Every time I looked at her, every time I held our child, I was reminded of how fragile and resilient life could be, and how much courage it took to love fully after betrayal. I found myself reflecting constantly on the lessons we had learned. Trust must be earned and nurtured, not assumed. Forgiveness is a journey, not a single act. Love is deliberate, persistent, and courageous. And sometimes, survival is not about avoiding pain, but about choosing each other every single day, even when fear and doubt whisper that it's easier to walk away. We began to imagine the future more fully. We spoke of family, of traditions, of small joys we wanted to preserve and pass along. We laughed at the small absurdities of parenthood, marveled at our baby's first smiles and movements, and learned together how to navigate this new chapter. And in all of it, I realized that love is not simply a feeling. It is a series of choices, repeated endlessly, that create a foundation capable of withstanding life's inevitable storms. Some nights, when the house was quiet, I would hold her hand, feel our baby sleeping against her chest, and reflect on everything we had endured. The betrayals, the fear, the uncertainty, they had shaped us, but they had not destroyed us. What had carried us through was presence, patience, and the deliberate act of choosing each other again and again. And in that realization, I found a quiet peace I had never known before. The past may linger, and life may always carry uncertainty. But I understood now that true strength lies not in perfection, but in resilience. Not in forgetting, but in forgiveness. Not in avoiding fear, but in facing it together. And as I watched her sleeping beside me, our child nestled safely between us, I felt a profound gratitude for the lessons we had learned, the bond we had rebuilt, and the life we had created together. Life, I realized, is fragile and luminous. It is unpredictable, often painful, and yet endlessly beautiful. And love, when chosen with courage, patience, and unwavering presence, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, to create joy from suffering, and to build a future worth embracing. And in that quiet, unbroken night, I knew with certainty we had survived the storm. We had chosen each other. We had built something real, something enduring, something filled with hope. And that, I understood, is the true meaning of love, family, and resilience.